Hi folks, and welcome to the Ace Tanker for the Pz.1. This is a Tier 2 German light tank, and it's as I rebought the tank to ace it, as I go back to pick up aces and tanks that I'd missed before, and seeing as this is German and it's a Tier 2, this is a tank I have not played since probably my first half hour of World of Tanks ever. So I started with the Germans. I got up to about Tier 5 on the first day on all the German lines, so yeah, it's a tank I would have played in my first half hour to an hour of playing World of Tanks. But anyway, I haven't played it since, rebought it to ace it, and this is it. Now, the Pz.1's history is infinitely more interesting than the tank is in-game. I found the history quite interesting, but it begins with the post-World War I Treaty of Versailles in 1919, I believe it was. Now, the Treaty of Versailles basically forbid the design and manufacture of tanks, or pretty much any military equipment, by Germany. Now, despite this, Germany investigated and studied tank design with the aid of the Soviet Union and Sweden, and in 1926 they developed the Gross tractor, or the large tractor, and that's a Tier 3 premium we have in game. So, as I say, that was developed in 1926, and in 1930 they developed the Licht tractor, or the light tractor. So yeah, they were experimenting with tank designs, but they were disguising their names by calling them tractors. But at the same time as they were developing the Licht tractor and the Gross tractor, there were a couple of German officers. Well, you had General Oswald Lutz and Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Guderian. He was a lieutenant colonel at that stage. They were examining and studying and proposing a new type of mechanized warfare that used tanks as the basis. Now, they would use a combination of fast breakthrough tanks, or light tanks as we would come to know them. They had infantry support tanks, which would be medium tanks, and then they had heavy tanks. But the development of these tanks was difficult, if not impossible. First of all, due to the Versailles Agreement, very hard to build up a tank industry while being observed, but more importantly, they were also very, very difficult, or it was very, very difficult to build tanks of the type they wanted due to the limitations of German industry. So German industry was hit hard during World War I. And they weren't anywhere near the standard they needed to be to build tanks. With Hitler's rise to power, however, Guderian received the support he needed, and Hitler ordered the creation of a Panzer Corps. Now, while Guderian actually wanted more heavily armoured tanks or bigger gunned tanks than other nations were using, a tank that would eventually become the Panzer III or the Panzer IV, basically designing a tank like that at the time period, it was essentially running before Germany could walk. So there was no industrial infrastructure. The factories weren't there, the parts weren't there, the raw materials weren't there to build tanks of the type Guderian wanted. So tanks were completely new, so no one had any experience building them. The crews had to be trained, and there were always observers enforcing the Versailles Agreement. So it was going to be very, very difficult for Guderian to get what he wanted. So to get into a position where they could manufacture larger and bigger tanks, they started with the Panzer I, which was based on the Carden-Loyd Tankette, which was a British design. It was essentially a machine gun carrier, but the suspension and the tracks were based on, the engine were based on the Carden-Loyd Tankette. And 6 prototypes were manufactured in secret as agricultural tractors. They later became known as Krupp tractors because it was Krupp who built them, but they were essentially agricultural tractors. Now, things get interesting at this point because the design of the Panzer I, firstly, they were armed with machine guns. They came with an MG-13. Now, machine guns were useless against any of the armour that existed at that time that other nations were using. So they were given machine guns that were already known to be useless against existing armour. They were also purposely given only 8mm to 13mm of armour. So again, they were considered under-armoured for the time. Most of the other tanks by other nations had at least 15mm of armour or more. So they were under-gunned and they were under-armoured, but they were done, that was by design. That was on purpose, because if they were building tanks, then the Versailles Agreement would have imposed sanctions. So they were basically started very, very slowly by building essentially a tank that could not compete with other tanks, and therefore wouldn't be seen as a threat. The next thing they did was they also classified the Panzer I as a training vehicle, not a tank or not a combat vehicle. vehicle to try and get around the sanctions. And finally, to try and keep Versailles, or keep the neighbouring nations off their backs, Germany basically designed the Panzer I, or at least the first 150 training vehicles with fixed turrets. So the turrets, even though they had turrets, couldn't actually turn. So they were considered absolutely no threat to anyone else at the time. So undergunned, under-armoured, had turrets that couldn't turn, were considered training vehicles in all the documentation that were called training vehicles. So they, even if Germany were caught building these agricultural tractors and, it was recognised that they were tanks, they were severely, severely underpowered and were no threat whatsoever. So that was very, very clever. But the other main reason they decided to design this Panzer I was to basically speed up the advance of German industry. Now, while the tank was underpowered, and it was deliberately so, the main reason for this tank was to basically allow German tank manufacturers to put factories in place, to put processes in place, to source raw material, and basically to speed up the advance of German industry in preparation for building better tanks. Now, Krupp, Mann, Henschel and Daimler, all names you should be familiar with, were ordered to start building Panzer Is. So they ended up building factories, and they ended up building production lines and training workers, and, started manufacturing parts. And essentially, they were preparing for the future. While they were focused on building the Panzer I, their main view was the future. They were focused on building better tanks for the future. So they got the infrastructure in place, and as I say, the first 150 tanks to be built did follow the training tank design with poor armor, machine guns, and turrets that couldn't turn. But the next 1,100 tanks that were built were actually given rotating turrets. So Germany were slowly stepping up to, building better tanks, but they had to stick with the Panzer I for the, in the meantime. Now, when the Spanish Civil War began in 1936, Germany sent 132 Panzer Is and their crews to support Franco. Now, this allowed Germany to basically put the tanks and their crews through combat testing, but it became apparent that the MG-13s on the tank couldn't compete with the Soviet T-26s and the 45mm cannons they were using, or the Republicans were using. So some of the Panzer Is were upgraded to 20mm guns, and back in Germany, development began on the Panzer II and the Panzer I Aus B. Now, the Panzer I Aus B had a better engine and a better suspension, because the first Panzers, the Panzer I Aus A, they were very, very unreliable. Roughly about a 30% breakdown rate with their engines. But the Panzer I Aus B had better suspension, a better engine. Now, this tank in-game is actually an Aus B because it's slightly longer than the Aus A, and it has slightly better armor, but not by much. But essentially, 800 Aus Bs, or Panzer I Aus Bs, were built between 1936 and 1937, and about half of these, surprisingly, were built as actual training tanks. So, the Panzer Bs, again, Germany afraid to start building tanks before they could, in case, the Allied nations or neighbouring nations came down hard on them. They again built 800 Panzer Aus Bs, but they basically, actually did make the first 400 of them training vehicles. But what they did with these training vehicles were they reinforced the hulls so that basically a better turret and a better gun could be mounted. So essentially, by adding a turret and a gun to the training vehicles, then Germany had Panzer I Aus Bs that were basically combat ready. So everything they were doing were basically, they were trying to build training tanks, trying to keep other nations off the scent, but they were preparing for war. Now, further development led to the Panzer I C, which we have in game at tier 3, and the Panzer I F, which we don't actually have in game yet, but the Panzer I F was basically a Panzer I that had 80mm of armor, and 30 of them were built in 1940, and some of them actually took part in the Battle of Kursk. But regardless, anyhow, the Panzer I, it was under-armored, it was undergunned compared to other tanks of its time, but deliberately so. However, in total, there were 2,435 Panzer I or Panzer I variants built. It modernized Germany's tank tank building industry, and it paved the way for much more advanced designs. And even though they weren't good tanks, they made up for it in numbers, and they were used during the invasion of Poland, the annexation of Czechoslovakia, the invasion of Denmark and Norway, and they were also used in North Africa. Now, as the war went on, they were used more as reconnaissance tanks or command tanks, but that's pretty much it. So it's underpowered, and it's underpowered in-game as well, but it was deliberately so. Now, in-game, the tank does offer decent mobility and camo, and that's pretty much it, because even though it has an autoloader, it's not a very good autoloader. I didn't like it very much, but if you hit and pen all your shots, it needs about 3 bursts to kill a full health tier 2. It's only got 30 millimeters of penetration, which is enough for most tier 2s, but you know, if you're shooting M3 or M2 lights from the front, you're not going to reliably pen them or do damage to them, or if enemy tanks have reasonably good armor and they're angled, again, sometimes your gun is not going to do a lot. It fires in bursts of 2, so there are 4 shots up here, but every time you pull the trigger, you actually fire 2 shots, so you fire 8 shots basically per clip, and you know, it is okay, but it, you know, as I say, one of the problems I have with the tank is basically it usually requires about 3 bursts to kill a tank, so and a lot of the other tanks in the game, because you've got no armor, can basically one-clip you if they've got an autoloader, or they can derp you, one-hit kill you if they're firing HE. So the biggest problem for me is not the armor, or not even the gun, which I didn't like very much, but it's the turret traverse. Yeah, the turret traverse on this tank is awful. You've only got a 20 degree per second turret traverse, which is essentially TD standards, and it's awful. It means that you're too slow. The turret traverse is too slow to track enemy tanks that are fast, that are moving from side to side in front of you. You can't get your turret on target. If tanks get to your side or rear, it takes forever for the turret to get around, and by the time you get your turret around, even by turning your hull, you're dead. So I didn't enjoy this tank very much, but thankfully it didn't take too many games to ace. And in addition, it's a tier 2, which means you get into Mittengard and a bad selection of maps, and you get into, you know, games with a pile of M2 lights on the enemy team, and as I say, it comes down to whether or not your M2 lights are better than the enemy M2 lights, and oh, alright, almost tipped my tank here. Is this the correct speed? There we go. Replay speed 1. Yeah, okay, so a little nudge, almost tipped my tank. You can see it's very, very light, very lightly armored. We're picking up a few spots. There are 2 M2 lights on the enemy team and only 1 on our team. Now, I do carry premium ammunition, but I try not to fire very much of it. But in low tier games, I've started carrying premium ammunition simply to kill M2 lights. If you let an M2 light live and you've got an opportunity to kill it, you have to. If you let it live, it's going to destroy your team. So I'm sitting here, I'm waiting for tanks to advance down the 1-2 lines, but for the first time ever on Mittengard, no one is coming. There's no one here. And I'm wondering, how long am I going to sit here waiting for someone to poke? I mean, I guarantee as soon as I pull out, someone's going to appear and shoot me, but no one's appearing, and it's kind of like, what's going on? This is like the Twilight Zone. So keeping an eye at the mini-map, and I see one of the M2 lights has gone into the dip over in D7, so he's not a threat. But we're going to advance and finally try and flank enemy tanks. So yeah, very, very unusual. So we're going to poke up, start shooting in this corner, and look at the accuracy. I mean, this is the rear of a Cruiser 3. Most of my shots missed, and those that did hit bounced. And this gun is just unreliable, and that's a second burst. We only do 53 damage to him, and alright, he's got backup. T2 medium, Cruiser 3. So I don't want to actually shoot. They're all looking at me. Okay, 81's advancing. Dropped off radar. Just going to poke very, very slowly. And we can take out the Cruiser 3 with a shot to his rear. Not much to shoot at the 81, but managed to sneak in a couple of shots there. Take him, oh well, someone else takes him out. But you can see the reload is reasonably fast. Alright, so just pop back into cover till I drop off. There's a Stridsvagen M38 and I'm on a reload, and I chose to reload at a really bad time, so miss out on some damage on the Stridsvagen M38, but do manage to sneak in a few shots, and then the T2 medium is back, managed to get one into him. Oh, and here we go, Panzer 38H. Yeah, have to switch to premium ammunition for this guy, trying to track him, shooting him through the lower glacis, take him out. Yeah, another very heavily armored tank, and you know, one I would have struggled to pen with regular ammunition. So yeah, I try not to shoot premium ammunition, but even at tier 2, occasionally you need it. So Lloyd gun carrier in the distance. You can see it's not really a sniper. I'm missing a lot of shots here. But reload is reasonably fast, and we can take him out for kill number 3. So, T7 combat car, M2 light left on the enemy team along with RT. Now this is dangerous, because the T7 combat car can easily clip me. I've only got about 8mm to 13mm of armor at my thickest, and the M2 light can easily clip me and still have lots of ammunition. Both these tanks could clip me and have lots of ammunition left over. RT is still in play, takes out a T26. So yeah, I'm debating whether or not to sit here, trying to advance against 2 autoloaders when you've got absolutely no armor. Absolute suicide, but yeah, I'm going to have to wait. I'm playing around, sitting here and waiting for the enemy tanks to come and try and decap me, but I'm on full health, and I'm feeling sorry because the M2 light's gone in by himself. He is doing damage, and screw it. No, my conscience got the better of me. I've got to go help this guy. He's down to 4 health. But yeah, conscience got the better of me, but at least if they're focused on the M2 light, then what we can do is we can actually do some flanking. So they're focused on the M2 light, neither of them are looking at me. So back with the premium ammunition to take out the M2 light. You can see even with premium ammunition we're bouncing on the M2 light, but we do manage to take him out. I don't have time to switch back to regular, but we're going to have to shoot the T7 combat car. I'm wondering if he's on a reload. It looks as if he's on a reload. We take him out, and I'm going to pause it here because something unusual happens. So I've only got 1 shot left in my autoloader. I've only got 2, so when I click the trigger, I've only got 2 shots coming out of my tank. That's only going to do 22 damage if I hit both shots, but FTBS is on full health, so we shoot him twice, and we kill him, because we managed to kill his entire crew. He only has 2 crew members. We fired 2 shots into him. We killed both his crew members with our 2 shots, leaving him on 68 health, and still managed to pick up the kill for kill number 6. So, yeah, it's not very often you get to kill the crew and leave the tank intact, but that's what we did there with the final 2 shots in my clip. But anyway, 6 kills in the Panzer 1. So we picked up the Ace, we picked up a Pascucci's medal, picked up the Top Gun, finished top on XP with 817, 421 damage done, 6 kills. So as much as I dislike this tank, it was a decent result, even if I had to fire a few premium clips, and ended up only earning 356 credits at tier 2 as a result. I hate low tier matchmaking, so happy to have aced this tank, sold it and got out of it. It wasn't even my first game of the day. I got into it, rebought the tank, decided to play it till I aced it, so took 4 or 5 games, but I didn't like the tank very much. We fired 99 shots. 99 shots, only managed to hit 63, and of the 63 we hit, we only penned 40. So penetration and accuracy are a problem with the autoloader. Spotted 3, damaged 9, destroyed 6, 109 assistance damage, and as I say, not my first game of the day, but we did ace it. So Panzer 1, it is done, it's dusted, it's sold, and thankfully I was able to cover the history on the channel, because I think the history of the Panzer 1 is interesting, but in-game, the tank is not very good. It's not a lot of fun to play, and really just play this tank, grind through it as quickly as you can if you're not worried about aces, and move on to bigger and better things like they did in real life. Anyhow, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.